The first thing anyone noticed about the house was the garden. Long before people admired the wide porch, the old stone chimney, or the century-old oak tree standing beside the driveway, they noticed the garden. It stretched across nearly half an acre behind the home, overflowing with colorful flowers, winding stone pathways, antique iron arches, and carefully maintained beds of native plants. To most people, it looked like a masterpiece. To the Homeowners Association, it looked like a problem. Ethan Carter had lived in Willow Creek Estates for almost 8 years. When he purchased the property, many residents considered it an eyesore. The house sat on the edge of the neighborhood, separated from the newer homes by a line of mature trees. While the surrounding community consisted of modern houses with identical landscaping, Ethan's property looked different. Older, much older. The home itself had been built decades before the neighborhood existed. Historical photographs showed it standing alone in open countryside long before developers transformed the surrounding land into suburban streets. That history fascinated Ethan. An architect by profession and a gardening enthusiast by passion, he spent years restoring the property to reflect its original character. He researched historical records, studied old photographs, and carefully rebuilt features that had disappeared over time. The garden became his life's work. Every stone path was placed according to historic layouts he discovered in county archives. Every flower species was selected because records indicated similar plants once grew there generations earlier. Neighbors frequently stopped to admire the result. Visitors often took photographs. Local gardening clubs occasionally requested tours. The garden wasn't just beautiful, it was unique. Unfortunately, uniqueness rarely impressed the HOA board. Willow Creek Estates operated under strict rules. Residents were expected to maintain nearly identical landscaping standards. Uniformity was considered essential for preserving property values. Most homeowners complied without complaint. Small lawns, approved shrubs, approved flower beds, approved colors, approved decorations. The board loved consistency. Ethan's garden represented the exact opposite. Over the years, the HOA sent occasional notices regarding various features of the property. Most were minor complaints involving decorative structures or plant heights. Ethan responded politely each time. Usually the disputes ended quickly. Then a new HOA president took office. Her name was Denise Parker. Unlike previous board members, Denise viewed enforcement as a personal mission. Within months of taking control, she launched what residents privately described as a neighborhood crusade. Warning letters multiplied. Fines increased. Inspections became more frequent. Several homeowners found themselves fighting citations for issues that previous boards had ignored for years. The atmosphere changed. Many residents felt intimidated. Few challenged her authority. Denise interpreted compliance as proof she was doing an excellent job. Then she noticed Ethan's garden. At first, the complaints seemed routine. The stone pathways allegedly violated landscaping guidelines. The antique iron arches supposedly exceeded approved dimensions. Several native plant species were labeled unauthorized vegetation. A decorative fountain became another issue. Then came complaints about the garden's overall appearance. The board argued that the property no longer matched neighborhood standards. That accusation surprised Ethan. The garden had existed for years. Previous boards had never objected to its overall design. In fact, many former HOA newsletters had featured photographs of the property as a point of community pride. None of that mattered anymore. Denise wanted changes, major changes. Over the following months, notices arrived with increasing frequency. Each letter demanded additional modifications. Each inspection identified new violations. Each deadline became shorter. Ethan remained calm. He submitted documentation. He attended meetings. He explained the historical significance of many features. The board showed little interest. Their focus remained fixed on compliance. The situation escalated during the spring garden season. Hundreds of flowers had begun blooming across the property. Visitors frequently stopped to admire the landscape. Social media photographs attracted attention beyond the neighborhood. Several local publications featured the garden in seasonal articles. The positive attention irritated Denise. Many residents noticed. Instead of celebrating the recognition, she became increasingly determined to bring the property into conformity with HOA standards. Then came the letter that changed everything. It arrived on a Friday afternoon. Inside was a formal violation notice unlike anything Ethan had received before. The board had conducted a comprehensive review of the property. Their conclusion was blunt. The garden itself violated community regulations, not specific features, not individual plants, the entire garden. The notice ordered Ethan to remove substantial portions of the landscaping and replace them with HOA-approved designs. Stone pathways would need to be demolished. Historical plantings removed, decorative structures dismantled, garden sections redesigned from scratch. Failure to comply would result in escalating fines and possible legal action. Ethan read the notice several times. At first, he thought there had been some mistake. The demands were extraordinary. Years of work could disappear within weeks. More importantly, the order ignored the property's historical character entirely. The following days brought growing frustration. Friends encouraged him to fight back. Neighbors privately expressed support. Several residents admitted they believed the board had become unreasonable, yet few were willing to speak publicly. Nobody wanted to become the HOA's next target. Ethan understood their hesitation. Still, he refused to surrender. He began gathering documents, property records, historical photographs, land surveys, archived county reports. His original goal was simple. He intended to prove that many garden features predated neighborhood regulations. If successful, the board might reconsider its position. Weeks passed. The conflict intensified. The HOA issued additional warnings. Fines began accumulating. Board meetings grew increasingly hostile. Meanwhile, Ethan's research uncovered something unexpected. While reviewing county archives, he discovered references to the property dating back more than a century. One document mentioned a historic estate once located on the land. Another referenced a formerly recognized heritage garden that had existed there during the early 20th century. The discoveries intrigued him. At first, he viewed them as historical curiosities. Then additional records appeared. Maps, preservation reports, survey documents. Pieces of a puzzle slowly emerged. The more he researched, the stranger the situation became. Certain records suggested that portions of the property may have received historical recognition decades earlier. If true, that designation could carry legal significance, potentially enormous legal significance. Ethan became determined to learn more. He contacted local archives, historical societies, county preservation offices. Weeks turned into months. While the HOA continued increasing pressure, Ethan quietly assembled evidence. The deeper he dug, the clearer the picture became. Something important had been overlooked. Not by him, not by previous owners, by everyone, including the HOA. Then one afternoon, an elderly historian reviewing old county records made a discovery that caused immediate concern. A forgotten preservation file, an official designation, a protected site. The implications were staggering. For years, the HOA had been treating the property like an ordinary suburban lot. According to newly uncovered records, it might be anything but ordinary. As Ethan stared at the documents spread across his desk, he realized the battle was about to change completely, and the people demanding he destroy his garden had no idea what was coming next. Ethan spent most of the next week verifying what he had found. Years of dealing with the HOA had taught him one important lesson. Assumptions meant nothing. Opinions meant nothing. The only thing that mattered was documentation. The forgotten preservation file sitting on his desk appeared legitimate, but he refused to celebrate too early. He needed confirmation from multiple sources before presenting anything to the HOA or involving attorneys. The deeper he investigated, the more extraordinary the story became. More than 100 years earlier, the property had belonged to the Whitmore Estate, a well-known landmark in the region during the early 20th century. Historical records described elaborate gardens, rare plant collections, and carefully designed landscape features that attracted visitors from neighboring counties. Photographs preserved in local archives revealed winding stone pathways remarkably similar to those currently crossing Ethan's property. Several iron garden structures appeared nearly identical to the arches that the HOA demanded be removed. Even more surprising, records showed that portions of the original garden still existed beneath later modifications made by previous owners. The modern neighborhood surrounding the property had been developed decades afterward, When Willow Creek Estates was constructed, the developers apparently overlooked critical historical records connected to the land. Either way, the result was the same. The original designation remained buried inside government archives while generations of homeowners remained unaware. As Ethan continued gathering evidence, officials from the County Preservation Office became increasingly interested. What began as a simple records inquiry quickly evolved into a formal review. Experts visited the property, measurements were taken, photographs were collected, historical maps were compared against current surveys. Each new examination produced stronger conclusions. The stone pathways matched original layouts. Several mature plant species appeared directly connected to documented historical plantings. Even portions of the garden wall contained materials dating back many decades before the neighborhood existed. The evidence was becoming overwhelming. Meanwhile, the HOA remained completely focused on enforcement. Denise Parker interpreted Ethan's silence as surrender. At monthly board meetings, she confidently assured residents that the violation issue would soon be resolved. Additional penalties were approved. New compliance deadlines were established. Certified letters arrived regularly. Each notice became more aggressive than the previous one. The total fines climbed steadily. What Denise failed to realize was that Ethan was no longer worried about the fines. His attention had shifted elsewhere. Every new document strengthened his position. Every inspection by preservation specialists revealed additional historical significance. What had started as a dispute over landscaping was quietly transforming into something far larger. The first warning sign appeared when the County Preservation Office requested access to old development records associated with Willow Creek Estates. Officials wanted to determine whether historical protections had been properly evaluated before construction began. That request immediately attracted attention. County employees started asking questions. Archived permits were reviewed. Old planning documents resurfaced. People who had never heard of Ethan's garden suddenly became interested in the property. The investigation remained largely invisible to neighborhood residents, but behind the scenes, momentum was building. Denise remained unaware. She was focused on winning. From her perspective, victory seemed inevitable. Most homeowners eventually complied with HOA demands. Why would Ethan be any different? Confident in her authority, she scheduled a special compliance inspection. Board members arrived at the property expecting to document continued violations. Instead, they encountered something unexpected: survey markers, preservation flags. County-issued identification tags placed throughout sections of the garden. Several board members appeared confused. Denise appeared irritated. The presence of preservation personnel only reinforced her belief that Ethan was attempting to complicate a simple HOA matter. Rather than exercising caution, the board intensified its efforts. Additional notices followed. The language became increasingly severe. The board threatened legal proceedings if demolition work did not begin immediately. That decision would later become one of the most expensive mistakes in HOA history. A month later, Ethan received official confirmation. The letter arrived from the County Preservation Office. Inside was the conclusion of the preliminary investigation. After reviewing historical evidence, site surveys, archival materials, and preservation records, officials determined that significant portions of the property qualified as protected historical landscape features. Further review was underway to determine the full extent of legal protections. For Ethan, the letter represented validation. For the HOA, it represented danger. Unfortunately, Denise never bothered reading it. A copy was sent to the association as part of standard notification procedures. The document was filed away and largely ignored. Denise considered it irrelevant. She believed HOA authority superseded everything occurring on private property within the community. That assumption proved catastrophic. Weeks later, the board voted to begin formal enforcement proceedings. Attorneys representing the HOA prepared legal filings. More threats were issued. The association demanded immediate removal of numerous garden features. The irony was extraordinary. The very structures targeted for destruction were now under active historical review. Government officials were documenting them. Preservation experts were studying them, and the HOA wanted them demolished. As summer approached, whispers spread throughout Willow Creek Estates. Residents noticed unusual activity around Ethan's property. County vehicles occasionally appeared. Survey teams conducted inspections. Historians visited the site. Many homeowners began asking questions. Some started researching the situation themselves. What they discovered shocked them. The house wasn't merely old. It was historically significant. The garden wasn't simply decorative landscaping. It appeared connected to one of the region's earliest preserved estate designs. Suddenly, public opinion began shifting. Residents who previously remained neutral started questioning the HOA's actions. Others wondered why the board seemed determined to fight against historical preservation authorities. Denise responded by becoming even more aggressive. Criticism only strengthened her resolve. She viewed opposition as a challenge to her leadership. Instead of reconsidering the board's position, she doubled down. More enforcement, more penalties, more demands. The conflict reached a turning point during a highly anticipated board meeting. Attendance exceeded anything seen in years. Residents filled every available seat. People stood along walls and crowded hallways. Everyone wanted answers. The meeting began routinely. Financial reports, maintenance updates, committee discussions. Then the garden dispute appeared on the agenda. What followed changed everything. For the first time, Ethan publicly presented his findings. Historical maps, archival photographs, preservation reports, official correspondence from county authorities. The room grew increasingly silent as evidence accumulated. Many residents had assumed the dispute involved ordinary landscaping rules. Instead, they discovered that the property might contain historically protected features predating the entire neighborhood. Board members appeared uncomfortable. Several exchanged nervous glances. Even some supporters of Denise began questioning the situation, yet Denise refused to back down. Rather than acknowledging concerns, she dismissed the significance of the evidence. She insisted that HOA regulations remained enforceable. She maintained that the garden violated community standards. She argued that compliance remained mandatory. The reaction was immediate. Residents who had remained silent for months began expressing concerns. Questions multiplied. Criticism intensified. Confidence in the board started eroding. The meeting ended without resolution, but one thing had become clear. The HOA was no longer fighting a single homeowner. It was increasingly at odds with historical evidence, preservation officials, and growing public scrutiny. Several days later, the situation escalated dramatically. The County Preservation Office issued formal notice that the property was being considered for expanded protected status pending final review. That designation carried legal implications. Any alterations affecting historical features could require government approval. Unauthorized destruction could trigger substantial penalties. Copies of the notice were delivered to all relevant parties, including the HOA. This time, ignoring the warning became impossible. Yet even now, Denise refused to retreat. She convinced herself that the preservation process would ultimately fail. She assured fellow board members that the HOA remained in control. She encouraged continued enforcement. A few directors privately expressed concern. Others worried about potential liability. But by then, the board had invested months of effort into the conflict. Admitting a mistake seemed politically impossible, so they continued forward. Exactly as Ethan hoped they would, because every new letter, every threat, every demand was creating a paper trail. A paper trail that preservation attorneys were beginning to examine very carefully. Late one afternoon, Ethan received a phone call from a preservation attorney reviewing the case. After discussing the evidence, the attorney made an observation that changed Ethan's understanding of the entire situation. The issue was no longer whether the garden could be protected. The evidence strongly suggested it already was. The real question was how much liability the HOA had created by attempting to force its destruction. As that realization settled in, Ethan looked across the garden he had spent years restoring. The flowers swayed gently in the summer breeze. The stone pathways glowed beneath the setting sun. What Denise viewed as a rule violation was rapidly becoming recognized as a historical treasure. And somewhere inside HOA offices, board members were preparing their next enforcement action, completely unaware that government investigators were now reviewing their conduct. The collision between the HOA and the protected historic site was no longer approaching. It had already begun. By the beginning of autumn, the conflict had evolved far beyond a disagreement about landscaping. What started as a routine HOA enforcement action had become the subject of county reviews, preservation investigations, and growing public attention. The story was no longer confined to Willow Creek Estates. Local newspapers began reporting on the dispute. Historical preservation groups took interest. Community organizations started sharing photographs of Ethan's property online. The garden that the HOA wanted destroyed was quickly becoming known throughout the region. Every new article brought additional scrutiny, and scrutiny was the last thing Denise Parker wanted. For months, she had operated under the assumption that the board controlled the narrative. Now that control was slipping away. Residents who once feared HOA retaliation were becoming more vocal. Questions that had previously been whispered in private conversations were now being asked openly. Many homeowners wanted to know why the board continued spending association resources fighting a homeowner who appeared increasingly supported by historical experts. Others wondered whether the HOA had properly investigated the property's history before issuing demolition demands. A few residents began examining previous board decisions more closely. The answers they discovered were troubling. Meeting records revealed that the board had received multiple warnings regarding the property's potential historical significance. Several emails from preservation officials had been acknowledged, but never seriously discussed. Legal concerns raised by certain board members had been dismissed. Documents had been filed away rather than reviewed. The deeper residents looked, the worse the situation appeared. Meanwhile, the County Preservation Office completed another phase of its investigation. The findings exceeded even Ethan's expectations. Experts confirmed that several sections of the garden retained original design characteristics dating back more than a century. The stone pathways were historically significant. Certain garden structures qualified as protected features. Even portions of the landscaping layout matched documented plans from the original Whitmore Estate. The conclusions were remarkable. The garden wasn't merely inspired by history, it was history. Generations of changes had occurred over the decades, but enough original features remained intact to establish substantial historical value. The designation process accelerated. Officials recommended expanded protections. Preservation attorneys became increasingly involved. State-level agencies started reviewing documentation. What had once been a forgotten property on the edge of a suburban neighborhood was suddenly attracting serious attention. Unfortunately for the HOA, their problems were growing just as quickly. The association's attorney finally completed a detailed review of the preservation documents. The response was immediate. An emergency board meeting was requested. Directors gathered expecting reassurance. Instead, they received alarming news. The attorney outlined several potential risks facing the association. The most serious concern involved the repeated demands to remove potentially protected historical features. If preservation authorities determined that the HOA knowingly ignored warnings, liability could become significant, very significant. The room reportedly became silent. For the first time, some board members fully understood the danger. This wasn't simply about losing an argument. This involved potential legal consequences, financial consequences, personal consequences for those who approved certain actions. Several directors immediately advocated for ending the dispute. Others suggested negotiating with Ethan. A few proposed withdrawing all outstanding violations and fines. Denise opposed every suggestion. Months of public confidence had transformed into stubborn determination. She viewed retreat as defeat. Rather than accepting responsibility, she insisted the HOA should continue fighting. The disagreement exposed deep divisions within the board. Trust began breaking down. Members questioned previous decisions. Old disagreements resurfaced. Internal conflicts intensified. Residents soon noticed the tension. Rumors spread rapidly throughout Willow Creek Estates. Board meetings became chaotic. Attendance continued growing. Homeowners demanded transparency. Financial concerns dominated discussions. People wanted to know how much money had already been spent pursuing the garden dispute. The numbers shocked them. Legal fees had accumulated steadily for months. Consultants had been hired. Additional reviews commissioned. Thousands of dollars had been spent, and the expenses were still increasing. Many residents were furious. Association funds belonged to the community, yet substantial resources had been devoted to a battle that increasingly appeared unwinnable. Pressure mounted from every direction. The preservation review continued advancing. Public support for Ethan expanded. Residents demanded accountability. The board itself became divided. Then the situation became even worse. State preservation officials completed an independent assessment. Their conclusions strengthened the county's findings. The property qualified for protected historical status, not just portions of the garden. Potentially the entire historic landscape area. The implications were enormous. Any destruction of designated features could trigger enforcement actions. Penalties could be substantial. Future modifications would require approval. Most importantly, historical protections carried legal authority far beyond HOA regulations. The balance of power shifted overnight. For months, the HOA had acted as though compliance was inevitable. Now government agencies were effectively declaring that the garden deserved protection. The contrast could not have been clearer. One side wanted preservation. The other had demanded demolition. Media coverage intensified. Articles appeared describing the conflict as an example of HOA overreach. Photographs of the garden circulated widely. Readers expressed outrage. Comment sections filled with criticism directed at the association. People who had never heard of Willow Creek Estates suddenly knew its name. And they weren't impressed. Denise found herself facing a reality she never anticipated. Instead of being viewed as a protector of neighborhood standards, she was increasingly portrayed as the face of an unnecessary campaign against a historic site. The negative attention frustrated her, but frustration did not solve the problem. The evidence kept growing. More historical records surfaced. Additional photographs emerged from private collections. Former owners shared information. Local historians contributed research. Each discovery reinforced the same conclusion. The garden mattered. The property mattered. The history mattered. And the HOA should have recognized that long ago. As public pressure increased, several board members resigned. Officially, they cited personal reasons. Privately, many residents believed the ongoing controversy played a major role. The departures created instability. Replacement members proved difficult to recruit. Few homeowners wanted involvement in what increasingly resembled a legal disaster. The remaining directors struggled to maintain confidence. Meanwhile, preservation attorneys continued reviewing the HOA's actions. Every notice, every fine, every threat, every meeting record. The paper trail was extensive. Months earlier, Denise believed those documents demonstrated strength. Now they appeared to document repeated attempts to force the removal of protected historical features despite growing warnings. The perception was damaging, potentially devastating. Then came the announcement that changed everything. The State Preservation Board scheduled a formal hearing regarding final designation of the property. Experts would present evidence. Officials would review historical findings. Interested parties could submit statements. The outcome would likely determine the property's future. For Ethan, the hearing represented validation of years spent researching and restoring the garden. For the HOA, it represented judgment. The weeks leading up to the hearing were tense. Residents watched closely. News organizations prepared coverage. Preservation groups expressed support. The atmosphere felt less like a neighborhood dispute and more like a major public controversy. When the hearing finally arrived, attendance exceeded expectations. Historians presented detailed evidence. Experts explained the significance of surviving landscape features. Archivists displayed photographs connecting modern elements to century-old designs. Surveyors confirmed historical boundaries. The presentation lasted hours. The evidence was overwhelming. Observers quickly realized the case for preservation was exceptionally strong. By comparison, the HOA's position appeared increasingly isolated. The association argued that neighborhood standards should still apply. Officials listened respectfully. Then they reviewed decades of historical documentation. The difference in weight was impossible to ignore. As proceedings concluded, many attendees sensed the outcome was becoming inevitable. The garden would likely receive full protection. The HOA would likely lose. The only remaining question involved consequences, and those consequences were growing more serious with each passing day. A few evenings after the hearing, Ethan walked through the garden at sunset. Golden light illuminated the pathways he had spent years restoring. Flowers swayed gently in the cool autumn air. The property felt peaceful despite the storm surrounding it. Yet Ethan understood the battle wasn't finished. The preservation decision had not yet been finalized. Investigators were still reviewing HOA conduct. Attorneys were still examining liability. Residents were still demanding answers. The largest confrontation remained ahead, because once the final designation became official, attention would inevitably turn toward the people who spent months trying to destroy what history had worked so hard to preserve. And for Denise Parker and the remaining HOA leadership, that reckoning was coming faster than they realized. The final decision arrived on a cold morning in late autumn. For months, speculation had dominated conversations throughout Willow Creek Estates. Residents discussed possible outcomes at community gatherings, on neighborhood message boards, and during informal conversations along sidewalks. Everyone knew the announcement was coming. Nobody knew exactly what it would contain. By noon, they had their answer. The State Preservation Board officially designated the Whitmore Estate garden as a protected, historic landscape. The designation extended beyond a few isolated features. It covered the property's historically significant pathways, structural elements, landscape layout, and numerous preservation zones identified during the investigation. The language of the decision left little room for interpretation. The garden possessed documented historical value. The site contributed to regional heritage. Preservation of its remaining features served the public interest. Government agencies formally recognized what Ethan had spent years trying to protect. The reaction was immediate. Historical organizations celebrated the decision. Local media published updates within hours. Preservation advocates praised the outcome as a victory for community history. For Ethan, the announcement felt less like a victory and more like relief. The garden was safe. The years of restoration had not been wasted. The countless hours spent researching archives, studying old photographs, and carefully rebuilding forgotten features had finally received official recognition. Yet even as congratulations arrived from supporters across the region, another story was unfolding. One far less pleasant for the HOA. The preservation ruling immediately invalidated much of the association's position. The violations targeting protected features became unenforceable. The demolition demands became indefensible. The fines connected to those demands suddenly faced serious legal challenges. More importantly, investigators had spent months examining the HOA's conduct, and their findings were beginning to surface. Documents revealed repeated warnings. Official correspondence demonstrated that preservation concerns had been communicated multiple times. Emails showed that historical significance had been raised long before final designation occurred. Meeting records documented opportunities for the board to pause enforcement and seek clarification. Instead, the board had continued escalating pressure. Those decisions now carried consequences. Residents demanded answers. The annual association meeting quickly transformed into the most heavily attended gathering in community history. Homeowners filled every seat. Others stood along walls and crowded entrances. The atmosphere was tense. People weren't there to discuss landscaping standards or maintenance budgets. They wanted accountability. Financial reports presented a troubling picture. Legal expenses associated with the garden dispute had reached staggering levels. Outside consultants, attorney fees, administrative costs, special reviews. The total shocked even longtime residents. Many homeowners were furious. Association funds existed to maintain the neighborhood. Instead, significant amounts had been consumed by a campaign that ended in complete failure. Questions came rapidly. Why had warnings been ignored? Why had legal risks been dismissed? Why had the board continued escalating after preservation authorities became involved? The leadership struggled to provide convincing answers. Months of confidence had vanished. The reality of the situation was impossible to hide. The HOA had lost. Not simply because Ethan refused to back down, not simply because historical evidence existed. The HOA lost because it chose enforcement over investigation, assumptions over facts, authority over common sense. As pressure mounted, Denise Parker finally resigned. The announcement arrived only days after the preservation ruling. Official statements described the resignation as a personal decision. Few residents believed that explanation. The controversy had become impossible to escape. The board she once controlled was fractured. Public support had evaporated. Trust had collapsed. Her departure marked the end of an era many homeowners were eager to forget. Additional resignations followed. Several directors stepped down. New elections were scheduled. Residents who previously avoided HOA politics suddenly became interested in participation. Many believed the community needed a fresh start. They wanted leadership focused on cooperation rather than confrontation. The election results reflected that sentiment. New board members campaigned on transparency. They promised better communication. They emphasized research before enforcement. Most importantly, they acknowledged the mistakes that had occurred. The change in tone was dramatic. For the first time in years, many residents felt optimistic about the future of the association. Meanwhile, attorneys representing the HOA entered negotiations regarding outstanding disputes. Months of fines were withdrawn. Violation notices disappeared. Certain legal claims were settled before reaching court. The association clearly wanted to move forward. Continuing the conflict no longer made sense. The financial and reputational damage had already been substantial. Additional battles would only make matters worse. As winter approached, the neighborhood gradually began recovering from the controversy. News coverage faded. Public attention shifted elsewhere. The constant tension that had defined the previous year slowly disappeared. Yet the effects remained visible. Residents had learned valuable lessons about governance, accountability, and the importance of questioning authority. Many discovered that HOA power was not unlimited. Rules mattered, but facts mattered too. History mattered, and sometimes the people enforcing regulations were not as informed as they believed. The garden itself entered a new chapter. Preservation grants became available. Historical experts continued documenting the property. Educational tours were organized. Community groups occasionally visited to learn about the site's history. What once appeared destined for destruction was now celebrated as a local landmark. Visitors often expressed surprise when they learned the story. It seemed difficult to imagine that anyone would want to remove such a remarkable place, yet that history became part of the garden's legacy, a reminder of how easily important things can be lost when people stop asking questions. 1 year after the preservation ruling, a commemorative marker was installed near the entrance of the property. The plaque summarized the history of the Whitmore Estate garden and recognized its importance to the region. During the dedication ceremony, historians discussed the site's past. Community leaders praised preservation efforts. Residents attended in large numbers. Many remembered how close the garden had come to destruction. Standing among the restored pathways and flourishing flower beds, they understood what had been saved. For Ethan, the moment carried special meaning. Years earlier, he had purchased a neglected property because he believed its history deserved protection. At the time, few people shared that vision. Many considered the project impractical. Others viewed it as little more than a hobby. Now the results stood before everyone. A preserved historic landscape, a recognized landmark, a living connection to the past. The journey had been exhausting. There were moments when surrender seemed easier. Moments when mounting fines, legal threats, and constant pressure felt overwhelming. But persistence had made the difference. Had Ethan simply complied with the HOA's demands, history might have disappeared forever. The pathways could have been demolished. The surviving landscape features destroyed. The connection to the Whitmore estate erased. Instead, patience, research, and determination uncovered the truth. And the truth changed everything. As spring returned the following year, the garden bloomed more beautifully than ever. Flowers filled the historic beds. The stone pathways welcomed visitors. Birds nested among carefully preserved trees. Life continued much as it always had. The difference was that now, everyone understood what they were seeing. Not merely a beautiful garden, not merely a homeowner's passion project, but a piece of history that survived because one person refused to let bureaucracy destroy something valuable. In the end, the HOA believed it was protecting neighborhood standards. Instead, it nearly destroyed a protected historic landmark. And the greatest irony of all was that the very garden they ordered Ethan to remove ultimately became the most valuable and celebrated feature in the entire community. Long after the fines were forgotten, the board replaced, and the controversy faded into memory, the garden remained. Quiet, beautiful, protected, a lasting reminder that history has a way of defending itself, and that those who ignore it often learn their lesson at the highest possible cost. The end. If you enjoyed this story, Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more unbelievable HOA drama and justice-filled stories every week.